I should have died at that intersection. The rain coming down so hard it blurred every streetlight into streaks of gold and white. My hands locked on the wheel, my breath shallow as the engine hissed beneath the crumpled hood, and for a second everything went quiet, like the world had decided to pause and watch what would happen next, and all I could think was, this is it. This is how it ends. Alone in a car that smelled like smoke and hot metal, with no one coming to find me. But then headlights cut through the storm, low and steady, not rushing, not hesitating, just there, like they had always been meant to arrive. And I remember blinking through the haze, trying to focus, trying to understand why someone would stop here, why anyone would step into something this dangerous without a second thought. And then I saw him, tall, composed, stepping out of a black SUV like the rain didn't touch him the way it touched everything else. His coat dark, his posture calm, his presence so controlled it didn't make sense against the chaos around us. And for a second, I forgot the pain in my legs, forgot the way the door refused to move no matter how hard I pushed, forgot the fear clawing at my chest, because he looked at the wreck like it was already solved, like I was already safe. And that made no sense. Not when I couldn't even move. Not when the air inside the car was getting harder to breathe with every second. Not when my phone had slipped somewhere out of reach and the world outside felt miles away. But he didn't ask if I was okay, didn't call for help, didn't hesitate. He just reached for the door and pulled. Once, sharp and decisive. And something gave way. The metal groaning like it had finally met something stronger, and cold air rushed in, mixing with the warmth trapped inside. And I gasped without meaning to, my lungs burning as if they were remembering how to work. And then his hands were there, steady, careful, lifting me out like I mattered, like I wasn't just another stranger on the side of the road. And I remember gripping his sleeve without thinking, my fingers tightening as the world tilted again, because nothing about this felt real, not the storm, not the crash, not the man who had appeared out of nowhere and acted like he owned the moment. And as my vision blurred at the edges, I heard him say something low, something I couldn't fully catch, but it settled into me anyway, heavy and certain, like a promise I hadn't agreed to. And the last thing I remember before everything went dark was the way he looked at me, not with concern, not with relief, but with something else entirely, something deeper, like he hadn't just found me, like he had been looking for me all along. I woke up to silence, not the kind that feels peaceful, but the kind that presses against your ears until you realize something is wrong. And for a moment, I did not move, did not breathe, because the last thing I remembered was rain and twisted metal and the certainty that I was not walking away from it. But the bed beneath me was soft, too soft, sheets cool against my skin, the air warm and still, carrying a faint scent of something expensive I could not name, and my eyes opened slowly, adjusting to a ceiling that was not mine, smooth, white, untouched by the cracks and stains I was used to, and panic hit me all at once, sharp and immediate, my body trying to sit up before it was ready, pain pulling tight across my side, forcing a quiet gasp from my throat as I steadied myself with shaking hands. And that was when I noticed the room, wide windows covered by heavy curtains, a chair placed perfectly beside the bed, a glass of water untouched on the nightstand like someone had been waiting for me to wake. And I did not like that. Not the order, not the stillness, not the feeling that nothing here happened by accident. And I swung my legs over the edge, testing the floor, grounding myself in something real. But before I could stand fully, the door opened without a sound, and he walked in like he belonged to the space more than I ever could. The same man from the storm, dry now, composed. Every detail of him sharper in the light, dark hair perfectly in place, eyes steady and unreadable as they settled on me like he had expected this exact moment. And I felt it again, that strange shift in the air, like everything had just adjusted itself around him. And I swallowed, forcing my voice to work even as my heart picked up speed, asking the only thing that made sense, where am I? But he did not answer right away, his gaze flicking briefly to the floor, to the way I was standing too soon, before returning to my face with something quieter, something controlled. And he stepped closer, not fast, not threatening, just certain, stopping exactly where he wanted to be. You should not be on your feet yet, he said, his voice low and even, like a statement instead of a concern. And that irritated me more than anything, because I did not know him, did not trust him, And yet here, I was in a place I did not choose, in a room that felt too careful to be coincidence. "I need to leave," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. And for the first time something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not anger, just a quiet understanding that made it worse somehow, because he had already expected that too. And he shook his head once, small, decisive, like the answer had never been up to me. "Not yet. Not while it is not safe." And the way he said safe made my chest tighten, because it sounded less like protection and more like a boundary I could not see. "What does that mean?" I asked, and this time he held my gaze without looking away, long enough that the silence started to feel deliberate, like he was choosing how much of the truth I could handle. And when he finally spoke, it was softer, but heavier, like it carried something I was not ready to hear. "It means the accident was not meant to leave survivors." And the room felt smaller the moment he said it, like the walls had moved closer, like whatever had followed me out of that storm had not stayed behind at the intersection. And then he added, almost under his breath but clear enough that I could not pretend I did not hear it, "And it means you are safer here with me than anywhere else." And I did not know why that unsettled me more than the idea of danger itself. The way he said it means the accident was not meant to leave survivors kept repeating in my head long after he stopped speaking, like my mind refused to move past it, refused to accept that something so ordinary, so random, had not been random at all. And I stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was exaggerating, that this was some twisted way to keep me here. But there was nothing, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty that made my stomach tighten. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him. "That does not make any sense," I said, my voice lower now, less defiant, because part of me already knew it did make sense. The way the other car had not slowed down, the way everything had happened too fast and too perfectly wrong. But accepting that meant accepting something worse, that I had been a target without even knowing why. And he watched me carefully, like he was measuring every shift in my expression, every flicker of realization, before speaking again. "It does not have to make sense to you yet," he said, calm, controlled, like he had already processed all of this hours ago, days ago maybe. And that thought hit me harder than anything else, because it meant he had been involved long before he pulled me out of that car. "You knew," I said suddenly, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "You knew something was going to happen." And for the first time there was a pause, small but real, his gaze narrowing just slightly before he exhaled through his nose, not in frustration, not in guilt, just in acknowledgement. "I knew enough to be there when it did," he answered. And that was not the reassurance he thought it was, because it meant he had chosen to step into that moment, not stumbled into it. And I felt something shift inside me, fear mixing with something colder, something more aware. "So this is not just about keeping me safe," I said, my arms crossing instinctively, despite the dull ache it caused. "This is about something else, something you are not telling me." And he did not deny it, which somehow felt worse than if he had. Instead, he stepped closer again, just enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his eyes, and his voice dropped, quieter now, but heavier, like each word carried weight I could not see yet. "You are right," he said, and my chest tightened at the calm way he admitted it, because that meant whatever this was, it was bigger than I understood. And before I could ask anything else, he continued, "But what you need to understand is that the people who wanted that car to stop moving will not assume you walked away from it. They will come back to finish what they started." And the room seemed to lose its warmth, the air thinning just enough to make breathing feel different. And I swallowed, my mind racing through possibilities I did not want to consider. "So I am just supposed to stay here?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I trusted him, but because I was starting to understand the situation I was in. And he held my gaze without blinking, without softening, as if this part of the conversation was the simplest thing in the world to him. "Yes," he said, "no hesitation, no explanation, just certainty, until I know you are no longer a target." And there was something in the way he said "I" that made my pulse quicken again, because it was not the police, not some abstract protection. It was him, his decision, his control. And I opened my mouth to argue, to push back, to remind him that he did not get to decide that for me. But the words caught somewhere between my thoughts and my voice, because deep down, beneath the fear and the confusion and the growing unease, there was one truth I could not ignore. If what he was saying was real, then walking out that door would not mean freedom. It would mean stepping back into something that had already tried to take everything from me. And as I stood there, caught between leaving and staying, between fear and something that felt dangerously close to trust, he spoke again, softer this time, but somehow even more certain. "You are not here by accident, Emily." And the way he said my name made my heart stop for a fraction of a second, because I had never told him who I was. The moment he said my name, everything inside me went still, like the world had just shifted again without warning, and I stared at him, searching for any sign that I had imagined it, that I had said it out loud without realizing, but I knew I had not. I knew exactly what I had said and what I had not, and my voice came out quieter this time, edged with something I could not quite hide. "How do you know my name?" And he did not look surprised by the question, did not even look like he had made a mistake. Instead, he watched me the same way he had from the beginning, calm, measured, like this was just another step in something he had already planned out. And for a second I hated that. Hated how composed he was while my thoughts were scrambling to catch up, because it meant I was behind in a situation I did not understand. "You were not difficult to find," he said finally, his tone even, almost too neutral, and that answer did not help. If anything, it made my chest tighten more, because it meant he had looked, intentionally, before or after the accident. I could not tell. But either way, it was not random. Nothing about this was random. "You looked me up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to hold on to something that felt like control, and he tilted his head slightly, not denying it, not confirming it directly either, just letting the silence stretch long enough for the implication to settle. And I took a small step back without thinking, the distance between us suddenly feeling important in a way it had not before, because this was no longer just about being rescued. It was about being known, and I did not like how easily he seemed to hold information I had never given him. "What else do you know?" I asked, and there it was, the question I had not meant to ask out loud, but could not hold back anymore. And something shifted in his expression again, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like he had been waiting for that exact moment. "Enough to keep you alive," he said, and the simplicity of it sent a chill through me, because it was not comforting. It was strategic, like I was part of something that required careful handling. And I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself, trying to decide whether to be angry or afraid, but the truth was, I was both. "You do not get to decide that," I said, my voice firmer now, even as my pulse refused to slow. "You do not get to decide where I stay or what I do." And for a second, I thought maybe that would be the moment something would break, that he would push back harder, that the calm would slip and reveal something sharper underneath. But instead, he just looked at me, really looked at me, like he was measuring something beyond my words. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but carried more weight than before. "If I do not decide, someone else will, and they will not care whether you survive it." And I felt that land somewhere deep, because it was not a threat, it was a fact, delivered without emotion, without exaggeration, just truth as he saw it. And I hated that part of me believed him, hated that it made sense in a way I could not argue against. And I turned slightly, my gaze catching on the heavy curtains, the closed space, the realization that I did not even know where this place was, how far from home, how far from anything familiar. And the word home felt strange in my mind, distant, like something I could not reach from here. And when I looked back at him, there was a question I had not wanted to ask, but it was there anyway, sitting between us. "How long?" I said, barely above a whisper. "How long do I have to stay here?" And he did not answer immediately, which somehow made it worse, because it meant the answer was not simple. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unchanging, like this had never been uncertain to him. "As long as it takes." And something in my chest tightened at that, because it did not sound temporary, it did not sound like protection, it sounded like a decision already made. And as I stood there, caught between fear and something I could not yet name, I realized this was no longer about the accident. It was about him, about why he had been there, why he had chosen me, and why walking away no longer felt as simple as opening a door. I did not realize how quiet the house was until he left the room, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but controlled, like every sound had been decided in advance. And I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, staring at the closed door, half expecting him to come back and say something else, something that would make all of this make sense, but he did not. and that somehow made everything feel more real, more final, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. My eyes moving around the room again, this time with more focus, more intention, because if I was going to stay here, even for a little while, I needed to understand where here actually was, and I took a careful step forward, testing the weight in my body, the dull ache still there but manageable, and I crossed the room toward the window, my fingers hesitating just slightly before pulling the heavy curtain aside, and the view that met me made my stomach drop in a completely different way. Not fear, not exactly, but distance, because this was not a city street or a familiar skyline. It was open land, stretching far beyond what I could measure, trees lining the edges like a barrier, a long driveway cutting through it with precision, and a gate at the far end that looked more like a boundary than an entrance. And for a second, I just stood there, taking it in, because wherever I was, it was far enough that leaving on foot was not even an option, and that realization settled into me slowly, heavier with each passing second, and I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away from the window as something colder replaced the initial shock, something more aware, more focused, because this was not just protection, this was control, and I moved toward the door, my hand wrapping around the handle before I could second-guess it, turning it slowly, half expecting it to be locked, half hoping it would be, because at least that would give me something clear to react to, but it opened easily, without resistance, and that caught me off guard more than anything else, because it meant he was not relying on force to keep me here. He was relying on something else, something I was only just beginning to understand, and I stepped out into the hallway, my senses sharpening immediately, taking in the polished floors, the quiet lighting, the distant sound of movement somewhere beyond my line of sight. And I moved carefully, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I needed to see first, needed to understand the layout, the exits, the possibilities, and as I reached the top of a wide staircase, I paused, my gaze dropping to the space below where two men stood near the entrance, dressed in dark suits, their posture relaxed but alert in a way that told me they were not just staff, and neither of them looked surprised to see me, which meant they already knew I was here, already expected me to move through this space like I belonged in it. And that realization made something tighten in my chest again, because it meant this was not temporary in the way I had hoped. This was a situation already established, already prepared for, and I forced myself to keep moving, step by step, down the stairs, my heartbeat steady but present, until I reached the bottom and one of the men inclined his head slightly, not greeting, not questioning, just acknowledging, like I was already part of the structure here, and I stopped a few feet away, my voice calm even as my thoughts were not. "I need a phone," I said, because that felt like the most basic step back toward normal, toward control, and the man did not answer immediately, his eyes flicking briefly toward something behind me before returning to my face, and I did not need to turn to know. He was there. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the air, the quiet weight of his presence stepping back into the moment, and when I turned, Alexander was already watching me, his expression unchanged, like this had played out exactly as expected, and he shook his head once, not dismissive, not harsh, just certain. "Not yet," he said, and there it was again, that calm refusal that did not feel negotiable, and I took a step toward him before I could stop myself, my voice sharper now. "You cannot just keep me here without letting me contact anyone." And for a brief second something in his gaze darkened, not anger, not quite, but something more serious, more grounded, and he stepped closer, closing the distance just enough that I had to meet him where he stood. "You can contact someone when it does not put them in danger," he said, and the words landed differently this time, not as control, but as a boundary I had not considered, and I hesitated, just for a moment, because that meant whatever was happening was not only about me anymore. It extended beyond me, beyond this house, beyond this situation. And as that thought settled in, he added quietly, almost like a reminder I was not sure I wanted, "You were not the only one on that road that night." And the implication of that followed me even as I stood there, realizing that leaving might not just risk my life, it might risk someone else's too. And for the first time since I woke up, the idea of staying did not feel like surrender. It felt like a choice I was not ready to make. The thought that someone else could be dragged into this because of me did not sit right. It lingered in the back of my mind even after he stepped away again. leaving me standing in a house that felt less like a place and more like a decision I had not agreed to. And I tried to push it aside, tried to focus on something I could control, something simple, like the rhythm of my breathing or the sound of my own footsteps as I moved through the space. But it did not work, because everything here reminded me that I was not in control, not really. And I found myself walking without direction, past rooms that looked untouched, perfectly arranged, like no one actually lived in them, until I reached a doorway that was slightly open, just enough to catch my attention, and I hesitated for a second before pushing it further, stepping into what looked like an office, darker than the rest of the house. The light filtered through tall windows, falling across a large desk covered in neat stacks of paper, a laptop closed at the center, and something about the room felt different, more personal, more real, like this was where decisions were made, not just where people stayed. And I moved closer before I could stop myself, drawn by something I could not explain, my eyes scanning the surface until they landed on a folder, left partially open, and I should have looked away. I knew that, should have respected the boundary even if no one had said it out loud. But curiosity pushed harder than caution, and I reached for it, my fingers brushing the edge before lifting it just enough to see what was inside. And the moment I did, my breath caught, because it was not random paperwork, not business documents or anything distant. It was me, my name printed clearly at the top, my address, my job, details I had never shared with him or anyone connected to him, and beneath it, photos, recent ones, taken from angles I did not recognize, places I did, my apartment building, the street outside the hospital where I worked, moments of my life captured without my knowledge, and something cold spread through me, not panic, not yet, but something sharper, something that made every instinct in my body go still, because this was not about the accident anymore. This was about before, about time I did not know I was being watched, and I flipped the page without thinking, needing to understand how far this went, how much he knew. And that was when I saw the note, handwritten, precise, a single line that stood out more than anything else, keep her alive, and my fingers tightened around the paper, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears, because that did not sound like protection, it sounded like an order, and I did not hear him enter the room, did not sense him the way I had before, maybe because my focus was too locked on what I was holding. But his voice came from behind me, low and steady, cutting through the silence in a way that made my entire body tense. You were not supposed to see that yet. And I turned too quickly, the folder slipping slightly in my grip as I faced him, my mind racing to catch up with everything at once, the accident, the house, the file, the fact that none of this had been random from the beginning. And I shook my head once, my voice coming out sharper than I expected. How long? I asked, the question heavier now, more demanding. How long have you been watching me? And this time he did not answer right away, his gaze dropping briefly to the folder before returning to my face. And there was something different in his expression now, not regret, not exactly, but something closer to acknowledgement, like we had crossed a line that could not be undone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but carried more truth than anything he had said before. Long enough to know you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the words did not comfort me, they unsettled me more, because they did not deny anything I had just seen, they only confirmed that. Whatever this was, it had started long before the crash, long before he pulled me from that car, and as I stood there, holding proof that my life had been observed without my knowledge, I realized the most dangerous part was not the people who had caused the accident. It was the man standing in front of me who had already decided I was not leaving. For a moment, I could not speak, could not even process the fact that I was still holding the folder, my name staring back at me like it belonged to someone else, someone who had been living a completely different life without knowing it. And I slowly placed it back on the desk, careful, controlled, like any sudden movement might change something I was not ready to face. And when I looked up at him again, the space between us felt different, heavier, like the truth had settled into it, and refused to leave. You said the accident was not random, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. But this is not protection, this is surveillance. And he did not interrupt me, did not correct me, which told me more than any explanation could have. And I took a step back, putting distance between us, not because I thought it would protect me, but because I needed it, needed something to hold on to that felt like my own decision. How long were you planning this? I asked, and this time, the question did not shake. It landed, and he watched me for a long second before answering. Not defensive, not dismissive, just deliberate. I was not planning you, he said, and something in his tone made me pause despite everything, because it sounded like the truth, not the full truth, but a part of it, and I frowned slightly, my mind trying to piece together something that made sense out of what did not. Then why me? I asked, because that was the question that mattered now. Not the accident, not the house, but the reason behind all of it. And he exhaled slowly, like he had reached a point he could not avoid anymore. You were connected to someone I was watching, he said, and my chest tightened immediately, because that meant this had nothing to do with me at first. I had just been close to something, or someone, important enough to be noticed, and I shook my head slightly, trying to follow the thread. I do not know anyone like that, I said. But even as I spoke, doubt slipped in, quiet and unwelcome, because I did not know everything about the people around me. Not really, and he stepped closer again, not enough to corner me, but enough that his presence filled the space. You were not supposed to matter, he said, and the words landed in a way I did not expect, sharp but honest. But then things changed, and I swallowed my thoughts catching on that. Changed how? I asked, and his gaze held mine, steady, unflinching, like whatever answer he was about to give would not soften anything between us. You were in the wrong place when something went wrong, he said, and I felt that settle in my chest, because it matched what he had said before, but now it carried more weight, more context, and I shook my head again, more firmly this time. No, that is not enough, I said, because it was not after everything I had seen. Not after realizing my life had been observed without my knowledge. There was something else, something he was not saying, and I could feel it, just out of reach. And for the first time since I had met him, his expression shifted in a way I could not immediately read. Something quieter, something almost conflicted, and he looked at me like he was deciding whether I was ready to hear the rest, before finally speaking. His voice lower than before, more controlled. I went back, he said, and the words hung in the air between us, confusing at first until my mind caught up. Went back where? I asked, and his answer came without hesitation, to the crash, and my breath caught slightly, because that meant he had not just been there once. He had returned, after pulling me out, after making sure I was alive. He had gone back, and I felt something shift again, something deeper this time, because that was not part of a plan, that was a choice. Why? I asked, my voice softer now, more uncertain, and he held my gaze for a long second before answering. Because I needed to make sure no one else saw you survive. And the words settled into me slowly, heavy and complicated. Because they were not cruel, not threatening. They were protective in a way that did not feel simple. And for the first time since I had woken up in this house, I realized something I had not been ready to admit before. Whatever this situation was, whatever role I played in it, he was not just keeping me here because he could. He was keeping me here because he had already chosen to protect me. And I did not know if that made him more dangerous or more necessary. The realization that he had gone back for me settled into my chest in a way I could not ignore, not because it made me feel safe, but because it complicated everything I thought I understood about him. And I looked at him differently then, not just as the man who had pulled me from the wreck or the one who had been watching me without my knowledge, but as someone who had made a choice that did not benefit him in any obvious way. And that made no sense, not in a world where everything so far had been calculated, controlled, intentional, and I felt my guard shift slightly, not lower, never that, but adjust, like my instincts were trying to recalibrate around something new, something I could not categorize as easily as before. You keep saying it was not safe, I said quietly, my voice more measured now, less reactive. Then tell me what I am actually dealing with, because I am already in it whether I understand it or not. And he studied me for a long moment, longer than before, like he was weighing something, not my question, but me, deciding what I could handle, and I held his gaze this time, refusing to look away, refusing to be the only one uncertain in the room. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something closer to truth than anything he had given me yet. Someone you work with is not who you think they are, he said, and my mind immediately tried to reject that, because it was easier than accepting it, easier than rethinking every interaction, every face I saw on a daily basis. That does not narrow it down, I said. But there was less edge in my tone, more focus, more need to understand. And he stepped closer again, not imposing, not forcing, just present. You stay late at the hospital 3 nights a week, he said, his voice low, precise, and my breath caught slightly because he was right. Because of course he was. You take the east exit when you leave, even when the west one is closer, and something cold slid down my spine. Not fear this time, but awareness, because those were details no one paid attention to. No one except someone who had been watching closely, and I swallowed, my voice quieter now. Who is it? I asked, and he did not answer directly, not with a name, but with something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. Someone who noticed you noticing things you were not supposed to, he said, and the memory hit me before I could stop it. A conversation half overheard, a moment I had dismissed because it did not feel like my business, because it was easier to walk away than get involved, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly at my sides. You think I saw something, I said, and he did not hesitate this time. I know you did, and the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt, and I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against it. But I do not remember anything important, I said, and that was the truth, at least the part of it I could access, and his gaze softened just enough to catch my attention, not in comfort, but in understanding. You do not have to remember for it to matter, he said, and something about that made my chest tighten again, because it meant the situation did not depend on what I knew. It depended on what they thought I knew, and that was worse, because it meant I could not fix it by explaining, could not undo it by forgetting. And I let out a slow breath, my thoughts racing through possibilities that felt too close, too real, and I looked at him again, really looked this time, at the control in his posture, the precision in his words, the way everything about him seemed to operate with purpose, and I realized something I had not been ready to admit before. If he was telling the truth, then staying here was not about being trapped, it was about surviving something I did not even fully understand yet, and that should have made me feel safer, should have grounded me in a decision I could accept, but instead it did something else entirely. It made me question how much of this had been about protecting me, and how much of it had been about making sure I stayed exactly where he wanted me to be. It should have been simple after that, a clear line between what I understood and what I did not, between staying and leaving, between trusting him or not. But nothing about this felt simple anymore, and I stood there in that room, the weight of his words settling into every quiet space around us, knowing that somewhere outside this house there were people who believed I knew something I did not even remember, and that alone was enough to change everything, because it meant my life was no longer mine in the way it had been before. It was tied to something else now, something larger, something dangerous in ways I could not measure. And I let out a slow breath, my eyes drifting past him toward the window behind, where the world stretched out untouched, calm in a way that felt almost unreal compared to everything inside this house. And I realized something I had been avoiding since the moment I woke up. I could leave if I wanted to. The doors were not locked, the path was not physically blocked, but leaving would not mean freedom. It would mean stepping into something I did not understand without protection, without answers, without him. And that thought lingered longer than it should have, because it was the first time I considered the possibility that he was not just keeping me here. He was the reason I was still standing at all. And I looked back at him slowly, taking in the stillness in his posture, the control in the way he held himself, like nothing in this situation was uncertain to him. And that grounded me in a way I did not expect, because if he was uncertain, he did not show it, and that meant whatever this was, he believed he could handle it. And I found myself asking a different question than before, not how long, not why me, but what happens next. And the moment the words left my mouth, something shifted. Between us, subtle but real, like a line had been crossed that could not be undone. And he watched me closely, not surprised, not relieved, just aware, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, something that felt almost like a warning and a promise at the same time. Now you stay close, he said, simple, direct, but the meaning behind it stretched further than the words themselves. And I frowned slightly, not in resistance, but in understanding, because I knew he did not mean just inside this house. He meant near him, within reach, within his control, and I crossed my arms lightly, more out of habit than defiance, and met his gaze without looking away. And if I do not? I asked, because I needed to hear him say it, needed to understand where the line actually was. And for a brief second the silence returned, not empty, but deliberate. And then he stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that quiet intensity that seemed to follow him everywhere. And his voice dropped, low, controlled, but unmistakably certain. Then I will make sure you do. And the words should have felt like a threat. They should have pushed me further away, made me want to run. But instead they did something else entirely. They anchored me, because beneath the control, beneath the certainty, there was something I could not ignore anymore. He was not saying it to trap me. He was saying it because he had already decided I was his responsibility. And as I stood there, caught between the life I had lost and the one I had not chosen, I realized the truth. I had been resisting from the beginning. I was not just surviving because of him. I was staying because some part of me believed he would not let anything happen to me. And that was the most dangerous realization of all, because it meant the only thing more powerful than fear in that moment was trust.